Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question is, can I analyze the case of Jan Broberg? Her case was featured in a documentary titled Abducted in Plain Sight. Just a reminder, I'm not diagnosing anybody in this video, only speculating about what could be happening in a situation like this. If you enjoy this video, please like it, subscribe to my channel, and consider supporting me on Patreon. I will put the link to Patreon in the description for this video. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, and offer my analysis. Jan Broberg was born in Pocatello, Idaho, on July 31, 1962. Her father, Robert, was a florist in business for himself. He had his own flower shop. He went by the name Bob. Her mother, Mary Ann, was a homemaker. Jan had two younger sisters, Karen and Susan. The family was active in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which I will refer to as LDS. Many people in the community where they lived were associated with LDS. In June 1972, the family met a man named Robert Berchtold at an LDS service. Robert has the same first name as Jan's father, therefore I will refer to Berchtold as Robert and Jan's father as Bob. The documentary refers to Robert Berchtold as B, which is what the Broberg family called him, but I feel like that's more confusing than just saying Robert. Robert was married to a woman named Gail, and they had 5 children. The Berchtolds and the Brobergs spent a lot of time together. Robert worked diligently to build a relationship with the Broberg family. Bob and Mary Ann thought of him as charismatic and likable. Robert once sent them a fruit basket, which appeared to have a significant positive impact on their view of him. Robert's fruit basket-fueled likability advanced his plan of becoming unusually close to the Broberg's daughters. He had a particular interest in Jan Broberg. Her parents noticed this special attention and found it to be disturbing, but didn't really do anything to limit contact because they really liked and trusted Robert. Jan was a fan as well. She thought of herself as one of Robert's children. Robert had a history of being attracted to young girls. This landed him in some trouble with LDS. The church sent him to see a therapist in California to be treated for these desires. As it turns out, the therapist once had a license, but it had been revoked. It doesn't appear as though Robert was getting good advice, or that he would have listened to it even if it had been good. When Robert came back to Idaho, he told Jan's father, Bob, that he needed to spend time alone with Bob's daughters as part of his therapy. Inexplicably, Bob permitted this. Robert would routinely spend time in bed with Jan. He did this 4 times a week for 6 months. Robert also made advances on both of Jan's parents. Her mother, Mary Ann, was attracted to Robert, and her father, Bob, provided manual gratification to Robert on at least one occasion. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On October 17, 1974, Robert asked Mary Ann for permission to take Jan horseback riding. Mary Ann allowed it, and Robert picked Jan up from her piano lesson. Robert drugged Jan with sleeping pills and staged a scene to make it look like they had both been kidnapped. He broke a window out of his car, making sure to get his blood on it. Robert then drove away with Jan in his motorhome and went to Mexico. Eventually, he committed an assault of a sexual nature against Jan. He convinced her to be compliant using a story about aliens, which I'll talk more about in the analysis. As this was going on, Jan's father and mother noticed that Robert never brought Jan home. Mary Ann did not report the kidnapping to the authorities until October 22, 5 days later. The FBI launched an investigation. They found Robert's car with the broken window, and they discovered that his motorhome was missing. They believed that Robert was a kidnapper and not a victim. The police did not have any success in finding Robert, but this changed when he called his brother on November 20, which was just over a month after the kidnapping. Robert asked his brother to ask the Brobergs to give Robert permission to marry Jan. Robert believed this would get him out of trouble. His brother revealed his location to the authorities. Robert was arrested in Mexico on November 23. Jan's parents picked her up in Mexico and took her back to Idaho. Robert was extradited to the United States and indicted for kidnapping. As the government was building its case, the FBI made it clear to Jan's father and mother not to have any contact with Robert or any of his family members. The couple did not listen. They spoke to Gail when she visited their home not long after Robert's arrest. Gail told them that Robert wanted them to tell the government they allowed Jan to go to Mexico with him. If they did not do this, Robert would expose the contact that he had with Jan's father. Jan's parents wrote statements saying that they gave Jan permission to go with Robert. They retracted their statements 4 days later. The government was not going to drop the charges either way. During this time, Robert stayed in contact with Jan. He would send her notes, arranging phone calls, and he sent her love letters. Jan told her mother that she wanted to marry Robert. In 1975, Marianne visited Robert in his motorhome. The pair had sex. They would continue their affair for the next 8 months. Jan's father, Bob, filed for divorce, but ultimately ended up working things out with Marianne. In June 1976, Robert pleaded guilty to kidnapping. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison. However, all but 45 days was suspended. He was released after serving 10 days in jail and moved to Wyoming, where he purchased a family fun center. I guess there was a big market there for kidnapper-managed fun centers. Jan told her mother that she wanted to visit Robert in Wyoming. Marianne allowed the visit to happen and even put Jan on a plane to Wyoming. After Jan returned to Idaho, she continued to express an interest in Robert. On August 10, 1976, Jan ran away with Robert. This, of course, represented a second kidnapping. Robert took her to Pasadena, California, and enrolled her in Catholic school, telling the nuns there that Jan was his daughter. He claimed that he was in the CIA and had been stationed in Lebanon. Something went wrong, and Jan's mother was killed. He barely escaped Lebanon with his daughter. I'm not sure how he explained Jan being with him in Lebanon. Maybe it was take your daughter to work day at the CIA. Either way, Robert warned the nuns that bad guys were after him and may come looking for Jan. The nuns agreed to keep her safe. Robert was questioned by the FBI. He claimed to have no information about Jan's whereabouts. He spoke to her on the phone on occasion, but that was it. While Jan was missing, Robert had frequent conversations with her mother, Marianne, during which he mentioned that Jan wanted to marry him. The FBI kept Robert under surveillance. One day they followed him to a truck stop where he used a payphone. When Robert was finished, the agents noticed that there was a phone book there open to a page that contained a handwritten phone number. They called it and learned that it was the Catholic school in California. This led to them rescuing Jan. Jan was returned to Idaho, and Robert was arrested for violating probation. He was eventually charged with kidnapping and impersonating a CIA agent. Jan's family felt as though she was a completely different person after returning home. She was distant and cold. On January 24, 1977, while Robert was still in jail, the flower shop owned by Jan's father caught on fire. Later, the police discovered that Robert had hired 2 people in jail to burn down the store. They were both convicted, but Robert was not. Robert was acquitted of the charge related to impersonating a CIA agent. He was also acquitted of the kidnapping charge due to mental defect. He was sent to a mental health facility in June 1977, where he was held for only 6 months. After being released, he once again established contact with Jan, but he was not as interested in talking to her as he had been when she was younger. After Jan turned 16, she was finally able to break away from Robert's control. Years later, Jan and her mother wrote a book about the ordeal. On March 6, 2004, Jan was at a university in St. George, Utah, giving a speech at a women's conference. Robert showed up at the conference. He threatened a security guard and then ran him over with his white minivan. Robert was arrested and charged in connection with possessing a firearm and assault. The incident allowed Jan to get a lifetime restraining order against Robert. Later, Robert was convicted, but before he could be sentenced, he brought an end to his own life. This was in 2005. Now moving to my analysis. Here are my thoughts on a few areas that stood out to me in this case. Item number 1, Robert used an unusual story about being kidnapped by aliens to manipulate Jan after he kidnapped her the first time. Robert kept Jan in a room in the motorhome along with an intercom-like device. Robert played a recorded message through the intercom in which he impersonated two aliens named Zeta and Zethra. The aliens told Jan that Marianne was her real mother, but Bob was not her real father. Her real father was an alien, so Jan was half human and half alien. Because Jan was special, the aliens assigned her a mission to save the planet. She was to have a child with a chosen male companion by the age of 16. If Jan was unable to accomplish this mission, the aliens would look to her sister to complete the mission. When the recording was done playing, Jan came out of the room and found Robert with his eyes closed and covered in blood. He was pretending to be asleep. After she woke him up, Robert told Jan about how, when they were driving, there was a bright light. He made it seem as though they encountered a UFO. He was just as surprised that this happened as Jan was. Not long after this, Robert played another recording featuring him impersonating the aliens. The aliens told Jan it was time to ask the male companion to do what makes people happy. Robert then committed offenses against Jan. This would be the first of about 200 times. Robert told Jan that the aliens told him that she could not talk about the pills that Robert had given her, the mission, the sex, or the aliens. If she did, she would be vaporized and terrible things would happen to her family. Robert's alien story would have been considered ludicrous by most people, but to 12-year-old Jan, it seemed possible. It's important to remember that Jan's parents were incredibly gullible, so it's really not surprising this characteristic may have been transmitted to Jan through a combination of genetics and her experience. Robert's story was quite effective. It kept Jan in a constant state of fear and motivated in several different ways. For example, it made her feel as though she was destined to be with Robert. Jan did not want the world to explode, and she did not want her sister Susan to be harmed. Item number 2, was Robert incredible at manipulation? Jan's parents would have people believe that Robert was a master manipulator. He was virtually unstoppable. He was so charming and attractive that he could get people to do anything he wanted. Does Robert's talent for manipulation offer an adequate explanation for the behavior of Jan's parents? Were they really mesmerized by his powers? I don't think this is an adequate explanation. I think that Robert was far from a master manipulator. He actually seemed pretty clumsy and transparent. He was certainly charismatic and friendly, but he was not at all subtle, like when he asked Jan's parents to spend nights alone with Jan. No reasonable parent would have permitted that, no matter how charming someone was. Which brings me to item number 3. Many people are understandably angry at Robert because he committed such terrible offenses, but some people also blame Jan's parents. Why did Jan's parents fail to protect her? This is just a theory, my opinion. It appears as though there were a number of unusual personality traits at work with Jan's parents. When I conceptualize personality, I typically use the 5-factor model. I remember the 5 traits through the acronym OCEAN: openness to experience, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. The extremes of any personality trait can be connected to maladaptive behavior. A few examples: there's a connection between high openness to experience and psychosis, high conscientiousness and obsessive-compulsive personality. Low conscientiousness is connected to impulsive and antisocial behavior. Extremely low neuroticism is connected to factor 1 psychopathy, like being cold and callous, and low agreeableness is connected to paranoia. High agreeableness is sometimes falsely conceptualized as exempt from the maladaptive behavior associated with extreme trait levels. After all, how can a person be too generous and trusting? As it turns out, high agreeableness is just as maladaptive as low agreeableness. Both extremes come with their share of problems. A person who is too agreeable is gullible and submissive. I think that's what could have happened in the case of Jan's parents. They believed everything that Robert said, and they did not have assertiveness. This is a very bad combination, Even when Jan's parents were skeptical about Robert's behavior, they were unwilling to stand up for what they believed. I also get this sense that Jan's parents treated their daughters as an extension of themselves. Perhaps there was a boundary problem there. Here's what I mean by this. Jan's parents were trying to be selfless, but they were not just being selfless as far as their own behavior. Rather, they viewed their whole family as being willing to sacrifice. Therefore, they were fine with their daughters also giving Robert what he wanted. Jan's parents were speaking for everybody. They made their whole family behave as if they were all overly agreeable. In a sense, they had toxic and contagious agreeableness. It spread through the entire family. It's one thing for an individual to be overly trusting, but extending that to other people is a boundary violation. Jan's parents were obligated to protect their daughters in a reasonable manner, but Bob and Mary Ann's levels of agreeableness were unreasonable. In addition, one has to wonder if there were some unmet needs in the marital relationship. Mary Ann suggested that Robert had a charisma that her husband did not have, and of course, she had an 8-month affair with Robert. Bob also had sexual contact with Robert, although it was ostensibly one time. It would appear that Bob and Mary put their own need to keep Robert happy above the safety of their daughters. Now moving to my final thoughts. When people think about maladaptive personality trait levels, it's important to remember that maladaptive agreeableness exists. No extreme personality characteristic is healthy. Being trusting and generous can be considered positive, but it is definitely possible for somebody to have too much of a good thing. Any maladaptive trait can be dangerous. In the case of Jan Broberg, she suffered horribly because of her parents' out-of-control agreeableness. Through her terrible experiences, Jan was eventually able to develop her own ability to be assertive. She learned how to avoid the mistakes of her parents. Those are my thoughts in the case of Jan Broberg. Please put any opinions and thoughts in the comment section. They always generate an interesting dialogue. As always, I hope you found my analysis of this topic to be informative. Thanks for watching.